Welcome to the Convergence Podcast. I'm your host, Ashok Shivanan.
The point of the meeting isn't to share information. The point of the meeting is to work through something together. It's just a constant flow of feedback and ideas, regardless of who's in the room, charging toward a goal.
On this show, we'll deconstruct the best practices, principles, and the underlying philosophies behind the most engaged product teams who ship the most successful products. This is what teams are made of. Welcome back, folks. On this episode, I am joined once again by Bailey O'Shea. Bailey and I worked together on a number of awesome engagements while she served as the head of product at Integral, leading our product management and product design practices. We worked together on engagements for clients like Ford, Honda, Bosch, Airstream, and Rocket Mortgage. Along the while, we've had to do a number of things to retrofit conversations, context, and even culture in some cases into the product teams for our clients in order for them to ship the best products. Along the while, we have noticed that there was a recurring theme of conversations that sometimes the teams had forgotten to have and had led to a lot of downstream issues. And we created both an ebook as well as an episode that lists out all the conversations. So check the show notes for a link to the ebook, and make sure to check the previous episodes if you haven't gotten to listen to all 9 of the conversations. We've then done a deep dive on each of them, and today's episode is around team norms and collaboration. We get into talking about some of the things like values, practices, norms that the team can align on, as well as how to work with each of us individually on the team and how you can use tools like DISC or Acumax Predictive Index and other behavioral analysis tools in order to drive some self-awareness to understand ourselves, as well as share with our team so they know how to best interact with us. Check out the episode with Bailey. Hope you enjoy it. Subscribe to the podcast to get future episodes as soon as they're published. If you find this helpful, give the podcast a 5-star rating on your podcast app or hit that like button on YouTube. Hey, Bailey, welcome back.
Hey, Ashok. Good to be back. How's it going?
It is going pretty well. I'm excited to have you back on to talk about the other 9 crucial conversations. And so today we're going to be talking about how we work as a team. Mm-hmm. And it's something that I think we've both been part of teams where we've didn't really talk about the values, the norms, and how the collaboration is at least in practice or ideally going to happen. And in fairness, everyone brings their best moralities and their best ideas and wants to help. And of course, like if you're going to be a team, that baton exchange between the sprinters on the relay team is just so critical. And so what do you think?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to putting a team together, it sounds so simple, but you have to get to know the people that you're working with, and that you're going to be working alongside to achieve this goal. And I think everybody sometimes is moving so quickly, and you bring people in later in the game or they join at different points of the longer conversation or the strategy, and people kind of forget how important that is, to kind of take a pause, quick pause, and have a discussion about how each person prefers to work. And that can be how you brainstorm, how you like to receive information, why you're doing what you're doing, and also maybe what are some norms or top line expectations that the team should have kind of a unified front, because that will drive how people work.
What are some of those things that tend to come up as conversations that were missed, or things that you would definitely want to make sure the team is talking about before we got right into the trenches?
Yeah, I can think of an example when we were working with a client. We were talking about almost like the fidelity of development. The client wanted to move really quickly, and there's a point there where you have to decide quality versus speed. And different people on the team had different perspectives based on the client's goal of what level of quality, they feel comfortable with given their own personal experiences or how they like to work. And the team really struggled with unifying those expectations and thought it was fine. Everybody seemed to think that they could work it out over time. And over time, it became very obvious that people were working in very different ways. And the code base and what happened with stories as a result and handing off work became confusing. And it was actually slowing the team down. And it was creating a lot of frustration in those relationships and how to collaborate and problem solve. One thing that really helped that team finally come to a mutual understanding around how are we going to build this? Like technically, how do we want to build this? Was having a conversation about if something goes wrong. So if we have a major error with the product we're making, what is the impact on the business behind it? What is the impact of the people using the systems? What do they have to do instead? How does that impact sales? Does it shut anything down? And after really digging into that scenario planning, if you will, it became very obvious that the business was super comfortable with risk. They had a backup plan that was more of a manual workaround that they were very comfortable using, all stakeholders involved. And so it definitely clarified this almost like vague quality versus speed into a tactical, tangible thing that everybody went, oh, okay. Like now I get it. Now I can move faster. Now I can make these compromises. And the team got on track as a result.
One of the ways in which you can unlock that speed versus quality conundrum is really defining both of them, right? And in this case, it's probably quality is the one that comes into play. And this could be one of those norms that it's important to talk about in terms of like, hey, at this phase of this product, what does quality look like? Where, like it could be functionality, reliability, performance, security, portability. There's a lot of things that matter throughout the life cycle of a product, and some things that maybe come into play a lot more in the future. I could even argue, like this might be blasphemy, but if someone's just running a test and you're doing a usability test in front of a user that's internal, then maybe security is not that much of a concern because you want to make sure that the interaction works, and it may or may not have live data. And going and spending a whole bunch of time on security there doesn't necessarily add a lot of value. In that case, it's maybe maintainability or reliability that was coming into play. And since it was such an early day and there were other things that we were proving out on that phase of the engagement, not having that conversation meant both people were right and both people were wrong. And there wasn't it was an impasse that we couldn't get out of until we started to dig deeper and understand that we had different definitions of quality, and the definition that was important at this phase was different than what some of the team members had in mind, and that ended up being the unlock. So I think, and maybe by extension to that, what kind of methodologies the team is following is another good norm in the beginning, right? In the early days of Agile, there was sort of maybe different swim lanes that people were very religious about, whether you're doing Scrum or XP or Kanban or whatever else. Now there's so many hybrids of those that teams adopt for themselves. And in the early days, it's probably good to start with a set methodology versus, I'm not going to comment on which ones I like better than the others because they don't really matter. For your team, it's making sure the team's all working off the same one and they have the same way of being able to adjust and modify the methodology. And that way, there is that common source and having that, I think even just having a conversation of what does the week in the life look like for a team, and all the way down to the nitty gritty of, hey, we're going to test drive the code. Yes, no, because in some cases, maybe it doesn't make sense. Like that example that you said, when it was an early spike, or are we pairing, not pairing? How often are we doing demos? Who needs to be there? And getting that all lined up early before we really get into the meat of the engagement, when everyone's still optimistic and finding their bearings, I think is a conversation that you and I both have had to retrofit into teams where it's just way messier trying to do it later. Better late than never, but much better to do it during that kickoff or that inception in-person meeting that you're on whiteboards and you can hash it all out before everyone maybe goes into a remote work environment and it's harder to do that kind of stuff.
Yeah, 100%. Setting expectations. And I think there's specific roles too on the team where it's more important or more critical for the project or the initiative success or the product success to have those expectations aligned. And so that would be product manager, designer, and engineer, like the lead engineer, the tech lead. The three of them need to be in lockstep in terms of how are we working, how are we handing off work to each other, and how are we going to solve these problems, and then check if what we're solving is working or not.
And I think we've called it before the life cycle of a user story, right? How does something start out from an idea, whether it's from marketing and sales, whether it's generated by the product team, whether it's coming from customer success or an executive, and how does that get from ideation to validation, prioritization? How does it end up in the backlog? When it is checked into code, how does that then go back and get tested, not just functionally, but also whoever suggested the idea, whoever is accountable for the outcomes from it, how are they checking if this feature or functionality does the thing that we intended for the customer and then subsequently for the business? And that is a conversation that almost no teams tend to have. I think in having those three roles as well as other stakeholders come in and kind of talk through that and have a general map. Now, the adherence to the map is, it's going to vary, I think, based on how stressed out the team is and what we're trying to push for. But there's a lot of value even in having like this aspiration that we're all trending towards and pushing towards, even if we're not hitting it off the bat as much as we'd love to, than not having it at all, where again, I think everyone's coming into work trying to do their best, and our assumptions and best moralities are going to come into play versus working on a similar way that everyone else is expecting. And I think that, I used the word baton exchange earlier, and I have never been a sprinter. I don't know if you can tell just based on how this all presents, but one of my favorite stories is I believe it was a Japanese relay team that came in, placed in one of the Olympics, I believe, or a world championship without having any of the top sprinters. So none of the individuals were in the individual 100 meter, and they still managed to place and get a medal because they just did really well at the baton exchange and the other collaboration parts. And I think it's a story that's maybe come up. I've heard it more from the collaboration conversations than maybe following sports, but it's the same kind of idea here, I think. Fostering an engaged product organization and aligning them with the principles around lean, human-centered design, and agile will more than likely lead to successful business outcomes for your organization. But getting started or getting unblocked can be hard. This podcast is brought to you by the player coaches over at Integral. They help ambitious companies like you build amazing product teams and ship products in artificial intelligence, cloud, web, and mobile. Listeners to the podcast can head on over to integral.io/convergence and get a free product success lab. During this session, the Integral team will facilitate a problem-solving exercise that gives you clarity and confidence to solve a product, design, or engineering problem. That's integral.io/convergence. Now, back to the show. You mentioned different roles, and I think it's probably common knowledge at this point that having that balanced team or cross-functional team of those three roles and placing everyone together with a business outcome is the way to go. I don't know if folks necessarily talk enough about now, okay, we've put all these folks on the same team or in the same team room. What are some things to get these folks from different backgrounds and different training to work well together? And I know you've done that a ton. So what comes to mind there?
Couple of things. So I'm going to pull from a couple of experiences, and one of them is working really well with a designer and also really well with a technical lead or a technical architect. Number one, it might seem obvious, but it's everybody knows the outcome that you're driving toward. Key in figuring out how you're going to show up. Also having mutual respect and understanding, where that person's specialty lies. What is their output? What are they responsible for? And how does that contribute to the larger team? So in the instance in working with a good friend of mine who's a designer, we had conversations about, hey, this is the viewpoint that you're bringing to these meetings. This is the viewpoint I'm bringing to these meetings. And so when one of us presents an idea, you almost have to expect some natural questioning of the idea or the proposal. And it's not knocking the idea down, but it's because you're sharing context of another viewpoint based on the work you're doing. So she had more of a user mentality, and I was coming with business metrics in that instance, or maybe stakeholder recommendations, or what we were hearing from the sales team, and bringing those to the table as problems. And then she's got the user problems on the other side. So we're really just open to rumbling with that. And I think creating the environment for that, a great idea is to just set a goal or an artifact that you're going to create together. And that allows you both space to drop questions, assumptions. We'll get into assumptions generation in another episode, but allowing both of you to get your thoughts out, or however many people are on the team, and then having a discussion. You can use voting mechanisms and other ways to prioritize what you're talking about. But the co-creation of an artifact really brings that out. An easy one is the user journey. What are we seeing at the beginning to the end? Or what is the flow of information on the technical side? What is that systems diagram? What are we expecting from the back end? And then you just gather all of those questions, risks, assumptions from all those different viewpoints and start to chunk into that and have conversations.
And I love that you clarify that outcomes piece, which again, I think everyone knows, but I'm still finding that folks kind of have the outcomes of the why listed as, for example, like, hey, the why is because we need a bridge, or that the outcome is that a bridge is built. And creating that safe space on the part of the facilitator, oftentimes it is the product manager, I think, who I would say is the number one accountability to say, hey, it's not just a bridge we're building, we're building the bridge so people can get from one side of this chasm to the other side. And then ideally even going even deeper, saying like, hey, on one side of this chasm is where all the wheat is, and on the other side is where the wheat mills are, or some kind of sort of really more tangible problem that's stated, so that the solution comes into play that everyone understands, and then is also able to ideate kind of easier ways or alternative methods to get there than the default that's being proposed around, hey, instead of building this bridge here, why don't, there's already a bridge 2 miles down the street, and maybe we use that bridge instead, and it's way faster for us to pay that toll than go out and build our own bridge here. And I'm going to stop going further down that metaphor before it gets totally lost. But I think
bridge,
that was
tolls.
A very last minute thing. Yeah.
Troll tolls if you're an Always Sunny fan. Anyway.
Yeah. So certainly I think the outcome conversation helps a lot with alignment too, because the friction's good. But that friction can also be the source of a lot of problems if there isn't that platform of collaboration that you have amongst the team members, which maybe brings me to some of the softer pieces that we've gotten to experiment with and see a lot of value with, things like values, like core values, and in addition to norms. And it definitely seemed a little bit hard to work with at first, and so just being so confounding, it took me longer than maybe I'd like for me to try it out. And once we got into really talking about what the team values in terms of behavior and principles, and not just frameworks and methodologies, I think there was some level of self-selection that also came into being with respect to who's on the team. Now, I get that not everyone has the autonomy to determine the core values of a team, but I think I've also seen subsets of teams that have kind of agreed to a set of core values, even if they're different from the company's core values. So if you're a smaller company, definitely look at the Patrick Lencioni exercise on how to come up with core values, and set that up for your entire organization. But if you are a small team within a bigger organization, I think there's some room to play as well, where you're aligning on behaviors that the team collectively agrees on, and at least surfaces where the disagreements are. And you're not necessarily going to be able to solve it in the beginning. We're going to have to do some work, and shipping code and getting stuff done in parallel. But having, again, more of an explicit discussion about what kind of behaviors we value, I think has led to just much higher levels of engagement on the teams.
It also gives permission to give feedback, which is super important. We know retrospective or plus deltas or whichever method you want to give feedback to your peers, you want that to be so free-flowing and natural. And the way to give feedback is to have everybody align on expectations. And then you point out areas where people are deviating from those expectations. And maybe you change the expectations as a result. But you've got to throw a dart at the wall in order to have those conversations. And so people don't take these personally. Because to your point, people are showing up doing the best they can. And that sometimes looks different than when you're working with one group versus another in terms of how the group prefers to problem solve or work together. Something that you said too that I really appreciate around information exchange is making sure that the point of the meeting isn't to share information. The point of the meeting is to work through something together. And so therefore you're sharing information in advance with each other as much as possible. People know where to get it. So if you're not proactively sharing it, they know where to look for it. And that way, whenever you're together, it's just a constant flow of feedback and ideas, regardless of who's in the room, charging toward a goal.
And then I think the last thing that comes to mind for me is something else we've gotten to experiment with is using tools like Acumax or DISC or Predictive Index to do some behavioral analysis of how we're each wired. And I like that it's been a forcing function for self-awareness for a lot of folks, myself included, really. And also can be a topic of conversation that allows team members to know how different folks like to consume information, like to sequence work, like to make decisions, like to communicate information. And I don't think it could ever have been used as an excuse for poor behavior. But at the same time, I think being more vulnerable and sharing how you're wired with your teammates gives them a little bit more keys to overcome some level of friction. And I've definitely encountered folks who are afraid of it being used against them, or folks kind of bad actors, and working kind of using this information to persuade someone of something that they didn't because it's conveyed in a different way. And there is some level of that, but in practice, I don't think I've almost never seen that come into play, at least on our teams or our client teams. It's been mostly like a pretty refreshing conversation to have, and explains a lot of things that might otherwise have been frustrating about someone's behavior, that you get to understand them a little bit more, and then they get to understand you more. And those one-on-one interactions or even group interactions, I think, can be a lot more energizing. What do you think?
Yeah, agreed. The benefit of those tests that I've seen anyway is that it abstracts something that feels so deeply personal, how I take in information, and it helps you articulate that, but it articulated in a general way. So it's not just Bailey prefers to receive the information in advance of the meeting so she can think through the problems, because Bailey is, whatever story you might tell yourself. I'm not as quick as Ashok at it, or whatever it might be. And instead it's like, no, this is just how my brain is most optimized to be a good thought partner for you. And everybody can learn to converge and everybody can find ways to improve, of course. But, you'll cripple yourself if you're always focused on all the things you can do better rather than being like, how do I really maximize my current work environment so that I can show up right now the best that I can and tell my peers the same. So I love things like that. I mean, it's the same thing as a horoscope or anything else. It gives you, a common language to have conversation about what makes you, uniquely yourself without feeling bad about it.
And the tools, the precision of the tools does come into question. And I don't think it matters.
Totally.
Very similar to a horoscope, where if I tell you that, like, regardless of what the tool comes back, if I just tell you that, hey, Bailey, I much prefer consuming information in bullet points. And then, that leads to your taking like longer form, synthesizing them down to bullet points for me. Or providing both forms for everyone, like for both types of folks who prefer long form as well as bullet points. Then if I tell you that I'm in more into bullet points, then that's something that I'm going to own and be higher level of accountability to than not having that conversation. It reminds me of one of maybe our mutually favorite engineers to work with, Shing, where, it might have seemed very hypocritical on both of our parts in terms of how we like to interact, where one of us was way more, I'd call it introverted, or tended to think a lot more internally and crystallize thoughts internally, versus the other who was more, and you can guess this is myself, who's way more of an extrovert and synthesizes thoughts by saying them out loud. And then what we realized from the tool is that there is how we like to communicate or synthesize our thoughts, and then how we like to ingest information and take it in. And in our case, they were both polar opposite, which made us really great collaborators. Shing preferred more information, and I tended to talk out loud, so he got all the details that he needed to understand the problem better. And on the flip, Shing liked to think about a decision, or to have a chance to internally process some thoughts before coming up with a crystal clear version, and then would communicate it in a very succinct way. As someone who prefers bullet points, I like that a lot. But we did have to learn that if I needed a decision from Shing, I would maybe ask him at the end of the day before his drive home. It's like, hey, I'm debating between A and B. Here's a little bit of the context, and then give them some time to go out there and process that thought, and then come back with where they land on it, versus asking them for the decision right then and there, where it isn't really giving them the best chance at how their brain's wired to come up with their best version of themselves. And the opposite for Shing, he may tell me something at the end of the day and ask me for a decision, and come the next morning, I wouldn't have formed an opinion yet. And instead, if he just came and asked me, hey, what do you like more about A? I will sort of ramble my way through to determining A versus B, because I got a chance to think about it out loud. And so, knowing myself, I would sometimes talk out loud in the car if it was something that I had to think about on my drive home. And knowing me, Shing would just know how to change the question from, hey, do you want A or B, to things like, hey, tell me more about what you like about A. And we would arrive at it together, and things that otherwise would be looked upon as hypocritical, of like, hey, you like to talk a lot, but you like to take only bullet points. And it's the opposite is true for him, where you don't like to tell me very much, but you like to, you ask me a lot of questions, could lead to sort of feeling like we're, just unproductive conversations if we don't take into consideration that, hey, we're just wired differently, and that's beautiful about us. And then subsequently to that, we can allocate different types of work to folks that are better suited for some things versus others. And so if I remember, the four kind of spectrums that we would look at were how you like to make decisions. You like to make decisions in terms of what's better for the group, or did you prefer what's better for you, or having your thumbprint on something? Did you tend to be more of an internal or external processor was the second one. I think sequence of work is another one. Of course, in our methodology and as we're scaling teams up, sequence and principles and patterns are things that we tend to look a lot for. And some folks are really well wired for that and need it, and others get kind of bored in it. And if you're doing kind of early stage discovery work that's ambiguous, there's even less of a linear sequence, I'll say. And so some folks tend to be wired a lot better for like that early swashbuckling kind of work. And they get really de-energized or bored or tired when things are too sequenced or too predictable. And on the flip side, folks that will help you take an idea and scale it from 0 to 1 to 1 to n, they like a little bit more sequencing and predictability, and don't tend to get as bored as the folks who do well in the discovery phases. And bringing in the right team members, depending on the maturity of the product and the team, I think can also be decisions that you can make if you get into thinking about this behavioral analysis. I would say, between horoscopes and behavioral analysis, I think I'd still choose behavioral analysis today as a predictive indicator of how a team might function better.
Yeah, for sure.
That could just very well be because horoscope science hasn't quite made its way there yet, but we'll see. We'll stay tuned on it.
Yeah.
In terms of norms, is there anything else that comes to mind for you?
The one thing that we haven't touched on that was pretty compelling to watch, I watched a team kind of turn it around, if you will, was around estimating work, pointing stories, technical shared understanding of complexity. And it became another forum where it was super important to have a really clear outcome, and then being able to give all the different types of thinkers the ability to kind of quantify what their thoughts are and then norm around that. A tool that we loved to use and still do today, and I would use it any day, is pointing poker for that. Because it's just basically it just collects. I mean, you could use a Zoom, you could use a Miro, but you basically want to make sure that you collect each individual person's feedback. And then look at the differences. And so I guess when I abstract that away to a norm, it's making sure that your team has the environment to accept all of the different perspectives whenever you're collaborating together. There is a world where people can move too fast and maybe miss a massive risk because you're not creating that safe space or even just spending time understanding the unique perspectives. So that's just a norm I think transcends every good, productive workshop I've ever facilitated had an element of that. And then at the end of it, when everybody's like, what made that so good? It's like, man, I loved hearing so-and-so's viewpoint on that. I didn't even consider that. And it just really pokes holes. You're all there just to poke holes and make it as best it can be.
I think there's the accepting part. And then the thing that I really like is that it almost acts as a forcing function for some team members who might be otherwise a little bit more quiet, where they have to state their opinion on something. And it's uncomfortable for them, like going back to what we just talked about before. Like some folks just don't like speaking up in meetings. Some folks just don't necessarily want to be as opinionated, and they find that uncomfortable. And creating a safe space for them to traverse into that discomfort has a huge value, where now as folks making the decisions, oftentimes we're not making decisions by committee, but we're using a shared perspective and looking at the same data. This just gives a much richer perspective. And it's always like most delightful, and this is maybe just a bias, to see the folks who are a little bit quieter come up with those really interesting, challenging points or alternative ways to do stuff, that there's, for whatever reason, like additional high fives that go out, the sleepers on the team that, put their head down and do a lot of great work. And you kind of assume that they're more on the execution side versus the idea or strategy side. And it's a matter of giving them tools and giving them tools for their ideas to come to the table just as much as the folks like myself who are going to likely be quick to form opinions or be pretty comfortable talking about them. And it silences us a little bit from taking up too much space compared to everybody else, and democratizes those ideas come into the forum for estimation or other decision making too, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm glad that you could join me here again for talking about the different 9 conversations, and looking forward to getting a few more of these out. For the audience, make sure to check out the link to the ebook that is in the show notes, as well as the episode where we have a short summary of all of the 9 conversations listed that you want to make sure that you have with your product team, so that there is a high level of alignment and a high level of delight for the folks working on the team, and subsequently for the folks who get to use your products. Thank you for joining me on the Convergence Podcast today. Subscribe to the Convergence Podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your content. If you're listening and found this helpful, please give us a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button and tell me what you think about what you heard today.